You're listening to TMI for the week of April 16th, 2018.
This week, Dave speaks to Zach Ruiter. He's an accomplished anti-nuclear activist and most recently was the co-organizer of the campaign to shut down the uranium processing facility in Toronto's West End. With Saving Green Energy, he has opposed tritium production and brought light to its export as a commodity. He has written for Now magazine, produced and compiled interviews and short video documentaries on nuclear and other pressing environmental issues.
How did you first become aware of the uranium pellet plant at Dupont and Lansdowne?
So I was a part of an environmental group of students at Trent University, and we caught wind of General Electric, which had a factory in Peterborough, and they had quietly received a license amendment from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission at a meeting attended by no members of the public to allow them to process low-enriched uranium right across the street from an elementary school. Huh. And all we had to do was sort of just raise the alarm and write a few articles saying, like, look, they got an amendment without consulting the public, and they were supposed to consult the public. So the CEO at the time, Peter Mason, came to the local gymnasium of said school and said, there wasn't really anything to tell the public about, and we put some flyers out and no one responded, and it's okay to assume that the public is satisfied. But you know what they do? They put a flyer in where they take out ad space in like a advertising flyer that comes on a Friday of a long weekend in a bunch of other junk mail, and you've been consulted. Right. And it was at that hearing in January 2010 or December 2010 at the CNSC that I learned that the license was for Toronto and Peterborough. Wow. And that the Toronto facility was actually 3 times more radioactive than the Peterborough facility, because the Peterborough facility receives the pellets, they shave them down, and then they put them into zirconium fuel rods, wow. Which have beryllium in them, and they have a beryllium stack. But in Toronto, they kind of get it in drums and sacks, and then they sinter it at 1400 degrees centigrade into the uranium pellets, and all the while they have lots of filters that are trying to capture the alpha radiation and the particles of uranium. But they do admit that they have 24/7 monitoring of the air, because the uranium comes out of their stack and it comes down the drain and into the lake, into the sanitary sewers. But the sewers sometimes overflow when there's flooding, so that can kick that uranium sediment back up into people's vegetable gardens in the city. In 2012, GE did some extensive cleaning of their systems, and they dumped 2.2 kilograms of uranium into Toronto sewers. Wow. We had a campaign, we raised a big stink, and we got shut down by Toronto Public Health, the Ontario, and the local residents kind of said that we were outsiders. Some people are more local, like the people in the low-income housing towers right across from the plant. But when it comes to the nuclear industry, no one can get away from it. No one can be truly an outsider. So we were the ones branded outsiders and agitators with an anti-nuclear agenda. But in the absence of that, I think people sort of just deferred to this idea that their NDP politicians at the time would hear them and would do right by them. But it just got buried, because it's not the hill that anyone wanted to die on, to actually take a principled stance and call for this plant to be shut down. The only politician that actually said shut this plant down was Sherry DeNovo, who's no longer in politics, but she was known for just being able to say what was right, but not necessarily have any mechanism within her party to have any coherent or consistent steps on acting on what was right. So the public really got duped into thinking that, that they didn't have to stand up. But the thing is like, no one really wanted to stand up because it would hurt their real estate values, and also it's instead of turning away from something that's so dark, it takes a lot of courage, and for a lot of people who are dealing with their daily lives, they don't want to take on the nuclear industry. So that plant is still operating. They've built 2 new condo towers right across from it, and largely the public, whether they liked their tactics or not, they didn't take ownership of it. Even the people in right next to it. And you go back there today and you talk to the people walking on the street right next to the sidewalk is right next to the plant, right under the stack. So especially if like today is raining in Toronto, that means that the emissions from the stack, which are just not more than 10 feet higher than the roof, are just put right back down onto them. It's not dispersed and diluted. It's right back down onto them. So it can be dangerous to just ride your bike next to that plant, or like you see mothers with babies pushing their strollers, and most people don't know. Like, just because it was in the news cycle for, a few weeks is where we could get it. Most people don't know about it. There's a really rich neighborhood called Regal Heights as well, and their public school is just up the hill from GE, and you can see the stacks from the public school. But you know what? They haven't done anything either. And there's, there are environmentalists who live in those neighborhoods, but they're professional environmentalists.
This might sound over the top, but I grew up at Dupont and Bedford. We lived there from
Bedford,
which is due east from Dupont and Lansdowne.
Yeah.
We lived there through the 70s. We moved away in 84, and 7 years later, my mother died of lung cancer. And
I'm sorry to hear that.
Cancer doesn't leave a calling card, as has been said. But, we lived there for, I don't know, we moved there in 74 or something. So 10 years there anyway. I was also born in Ottawa, so my mother spent some portion of her life in Ottawa, which of course is right next to Chalk River. So, in Ontario, it doesn't matter where you go. You're either upwind or downwind from something, from a dump site, from a factory, from a plant, from a former mine, from an intermediate waste storage site on its, or behind a rusty truck on the 401 with the nuclear emblem on the back of it. So we are literally surrounded in every direction. Then you throw in the nuclear plants and installations on Lake Erie, on Lake Ontario. It's like an epicenter that we're in.
Well, I'm sorry to hear about your mother.
Well, I mean, and there's no proof of any cause and effect, but here's an example of living literally downwind from this plant.
Yeah.
And 6 or 7 years later. I mean, yeah. So some of us actually, whether, truly or just theoretically, could be connected to this issue through, and so bring, this really, is where I'm trying to lead here is, could there be an epidemiological study done with
who's going to do it? No one wants it. To get an epidemiological study done, I mean,
if it's safe, my argument is if it's so safe, then BWXT should be right into doing it to prove how wonderful and safe and how those.
You know that's a rhetorical argument because you know that they don't want that. I mean, there was a family living right across the street, and they were shocked to find out, like on Brandon Avenue, the other side of GE plant there. They lived on Brandon Avenue, and they were shocked to find out that it was a uranium plant. And then during the time of our campaign, the wife died of cancer. A block over, there was a woman who had 3 kids, and she died of brain cancer. there's anecdotal evidence, but the thing was is that GE plant was part of a GE campus. Across the street was also PCB manufacturing as well. In Peterborough, Ontario, where GE worked on its motors and uranium and stuff like that, there's a huge story there on the numbers of retired workers with terminal cancers being in magnitudes higher excess than the background levels of cancer in the population, and they're seeking compensation. But in a city like Toronto, which is huge, people can be more transient within the city, in and out of the city, and there's no way to find out about who all the former workers of GE were and what's the state of their health now. And it's largely because of a few activists in Peterborough and the Peterborough Coalition for Occupational Environmental Safety that has been collecting the health information and doing their own health clinics on all these former workers that led to this push. But I have no doubt that all the former workers of GE are not as a group not doing well. But there's just no way to connect with them. There's no drive to
collect
push
the data, because the data is probably
a way that
there.
makes things happen. Yeah, but I mean,
in terms of hospital records and medical procedures performed,
yeah,
the data's there, but who's going to dig for it? Is your point? Who's
going to dig for it? But the story that you told me about your mother is something that I get a lot. Huh. It's remarkably common for me to hear from people whose parents worked in nuclear reactors and died in their 50s or died in their early 60s as a result of cancers. And what happens is once that's happened, it has taken such a toll on the family. It has taken such a fight from that family that sometimes there's nothing left to go after the industry after they could have cost the life of a parent. Like like our dear friend and the co-organizer of the uranium campaign in Toronto, Carrie Lester, just died of cancer on February 24th. And she fought colonialism and extractive industries till her last days. But, with most of these families that go through these fights, it's all on an individual level. It's never against the cause of the cancer. And then when people are saddled with these cancers because of the rising levels of ambient pollution in our environment, that's where their attention goes.
Mm-hmm.
And the woman who died of brain cancer, sure, you can't say that it was because of this plant and not something else, but that's an indignity to that family to know that there is a cancerous, carcinogen spewing factory that was doing it under their noses for the years that they were living there, and then their mom died of brain cancer. So you can't say it wasn't caused by that factory. They tested the soil by the tracks outside of the plant, and it was above the residential limit for soil contamination of uranium.
Wow.
And they said that's because they used to wash their components in the 70s, right, out back.
Yeah. As a kid, I walked along those tracks. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And animals use those tracks as transportation corridors to get around the city. There's lots of wildlife that gets pushed into those tracks, and I think those tracks, like often roads and tracks and stuff like that, are just following what were natural trails before the track was even there.
So that track is an interesting subject on its own. So 1989 Mississauga Trail derailment, which is just, photos of giant fireballs. And same tracks. And your Lac Megantic explosion.
But the Lac Megantic rail car rolled right next to the GE plant. So the question is if a Lac Megantic happened right there, next to all of that uranium just sitting there, it could contaminate the entire city. General Electric had a fire in 1999, and they said it was a safety mechanism, but they had a fire there. Another thing is, I think in 2015 in September, there was a train derailment on that. It was not a very serious train derailment on that very same line by Spadina and Dupont. And when we did a blockade in I think 2013 of the tracks to protest the GE plant, Song de Clay, Kathy Walker, one of the leaders of the campaign to get against the uranium plant in Idle No More Toronto, she warned that if a train were to derail and cause an explosion, it could contaminate the entire city. And that was before Lac Megantic. But when we were spending time in that neighborhood, around the junction, around Landsdowne and Dupont and stuff like that, everyone would tell us about the train of doom. That's what they called it. They said that there was a train that went by with these cylindrical canisters, and it would always give them a creepy, creepy vibe. And we heard that from people all over the neighborhood. I'm talking maybe 30 different people that we talked to knew about that train of doom, and that's what they called it. No one, people listen to us, but no one who is responsible at all for anything actually listened to us or did anything about it. And that's frustrating.
Are you part of an organization?
When we were doing our activism against the uranium plants in Toronto's West End at Landsdowne and Dupont, we were working with the Committee for Future Generations, which is a group of Cree, Dene, and Métis and settler people in northern Saskatchewan opposing the effects of uranium mining on their lands and the targeting of their lands for the sale of high-level nuclear waste storage.
Wow.
So it was all grassroots. So with Idle No More, we blockaded the CP rail line that runs just a few feet away from the plant, the same line that the Megantic bomb train rolled by.
Yeah.
And when I was in Peterborough, I was with Safe and Green Energy Peterborough, but it's whether you put a name to it or not, it's just people standing up to the nuclear industry.
It's people who just donate their own time and energy into causes.
Yeah, no one's going to become rich off of anti-nuclear activism. If you're lucky, you can somehow raise enough money to have your expenses reimbursed.
I think at all these meetings and hearings, we should have a Starbucks or something more politically correct than that. But, with fresh croissants and handing out coffees and... No,
they have that, but it's a room in which the proponent and the regulator go in together.
Right.
And the people who are there to ostensibly be the ones who are actually heard don't get to go into that room.
I've heard some of these people who present, probably the proponent side, actually get a small little office where they can prepare notes, work on their laptop, actually coordinate their message. There's office space available.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. I know they have like a bit of a lounge at places.
Free Wi-Fi.
Janet McNeil from Durham Nuclear Awareness likes to call it a kangaroo court.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she'll dress up as a kangaroo.
Yes. Yeah.
I think I saw a news story that said no kangaroos welcome at these meetings. And it was done in a humorous way, but acknowledging she's becoming known for. Stunts like that, they're pretty important in terms of just, well, here we are talking about it. It creates some fun to it. It adds to the idea that, these are places sometimes to meet other people, like-minded people. Maybe there's a ringleader in a social group that brings all their friends to one of these things, and it becomes a way to make it feel more like a community.
I mean, there is, but you have to remember that you are going up against the military-industrial complex, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Like you are opposing the interests of the military, and you're doing it. You're doing it as just these people, and sometimes you're limited to 10 minutes.
How intimidated by that are you?
I don't know. It's no secret that under Harper, who brought in, I guess, Bill C-51, it's no secret that the intelligence community is keeping tracks on demonstrations.
Mm-hmm.
They're keeping track of activists. It's to be expected that the nuclear industry will know who you are because you have had the courage to stand up.
That's not new news. I remember in the early 80s that the OPP, I think it was keeping a list of names who were at these anti-nuclear gatherings. I think the organization that was big at the time was called ACT or something. And I remember, it was almost like a warning hearing it in the news that you get put on these kind of lists, watch lists.
To dissuade people from getting involved. But on the flip side, getting involved can be very empowering. I remember I was at the Darlington hearings, and that was the first time maybe in 2011 or 10 that I met legendary anti-nuclear activist Patricia Lawson from Port Hope.
Mm-hmm.
And she was in her late 80s at the time. She's now passed on, but she said, I passed the torch on to you.
Wow.
It is important. I feel it's the bare minimum that, of course, we need to go to these hearings. There's been some difference in the anti-nuclear community in terms of how much attention should we put to these hearings because, as we all know, public consultation can be designed in such a way that it simultaneously incorporates yet disenfranchises dissident voices. So it's sort of like, we heard you and we made the decision, therefore you have been consulted.
So it manufactures consent.
Yeah, you could say so. If I had a critique of anti-nuclear activists, it would be that direct action is just as important as appearing at hearings and having a case. And I think that you're not going to be successful with one and not the other. And I feel there's an alarming lack of direct action against the nuclear industry. And let me just segue into something that's something that I want to bring up. There's a 50 gigaton bubble of methane under the East Siberian Arctic ice shelf, or the East Siberian Arctic Sea, that could burp at any time. It could just be released in an immediate release, and that would add so much more powerful greenhouse gas to our atmosphere, the equivalent to about maybe over a quarter of what we've already released as humans since the beginning of the industrial age. So the background or the context by which we go to these nuclear hearings and we talk about the half-lives of uranium being in the millions of the years, what we're talking about is the possibility that everything will break down. Just acknowledging that we need to acknowledge the possibility. We often hear, if we don't do anything by 2100, climate change may be the end of times. But we have to recognize that the possibility is there, that it's a lot sooner, and not sort of cling to those 2100 sort of end of century sort of models, because that just leads to more procrastination. You hear this statistic all the time that frames like a binary between climate believers and climate deniers.
Right.
97% of climate scientists believe that climate change is man-made and real, and the other 3% are just paid by oil companies. But you'll have the Canadian Liberal government and Minister McKenna wearing an Enbridge apron, which is the pipeline company, at a pancake breakfast, and calling herself a climate champion. At the same time as arguing with her government that building new pipelines will facilitate the transition to clean energy in the future and allow for the green economy. But let me get back to nuclear. If we have a 5, 10, or even 20 years left, if we don't radically alter our society and go carbon neutral overnight, what you will have is a breakdown of society, a breakdown of civilization, and no one there to prevent the nuclear plants from catastrophe. I know there's a movement by OPG and others to call nuclear the solution to climate change because it emits relatively low carbon while it's operating, notwithstanding the life cycle of uranium. But we are looking at climate change being so serious and so denied in terms of its urgency that we really don't know what's coming to us with all these nuclear plants around the world.
Maybe it doesn't have to be the Siberian methane. Maybe it doesn't have to be, even 15, 20 years, or 5 or 10, for the calamity to happen. And maybe it doesn't even have to be climate change. It could be any number of things, a war, economic collapse, that puts pressure on the systems that we use just even to limit carbon. So like if we all had to start burning our furniture for heat, there's all kinds of calamities that could occur that limit our ability to maintain the waste or shut down these plants, or that maybe if climate change occurs rapidly, you've got sea and water level rises in places they haven't ever been. And this is where we like to cite nuclear power plants and facilities, is right next to water. It would take immense amounts of funds to deal with those kinds of emergencies at a time where there's other economic pressures on the society itself, i.e. a time of calamity. But couldn't the methane model you talked about in Siberia, this is the same around the Arctic Circle, is it not? That as ocean temperatures rise, new areas are being denuded.
Well, it's one of 50 known positive feedback mechanisms.
Okay.
And these could have already all been triggered.
Right.
I'm working with a new term. It's not climate denial, but climate deception. So people can say, we know about climate change, we know it's serious, but there's this deception about how serious and how urgent it is. Well, and that's completely at work in the nuclear industry.
Well, what you talk about in terms of climate change denial, I mean, don't we just have to look south to see all of what you said evidenced? I mean, they are directly climate deniers, the Trump administration. I mean, they're old school climate deniers, and they provide sort of like a moral high ground to the climate deceivers who say, Trump is a climate denier. Look at me, I believe in climate change. But the people who supposedly believe in climate change, even they're not acknowledging the reality of it and the urgency of it. For example, one of the most bizarre experiences that I have ever seen was the 2015 Pembina Institute Gala.
they called it the Ungala for some reason, because maybe galas were a little too cliche. Their main sponsors were, and this is an environmental organization from out west, their main sponsors were Synovus, Suncor, and Bruce Power.
Yeah.
Premier Wynne was there, former chief planner of the city, Keysmat was there. They were all wearing like plastic Stetson cowboy hats, and the meal was braised baby beef short ribs. So you can have a group that is ostensibly about protecting the environment and stopping climate change at a hoedown in Toronto with, the worst offenders of climate change and eating beef ribs. I mean, that's another issue that I've taken up seriously since I've done the nuclear stuff, is the climate impacts of animal agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
People don't like to acknowledge that animal agriculture contributes more greenhouse gases than all forms of transportation combined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think I saw a chart once of a pie graph of sources of greenhouse gases. And you see it divided into electric production, transportation, agriculture, and then natural sources. And the pie graph is very revealing that electricity, essentially, and energy is a very small portion of the pie chart in terms of greenhouse gases. So this idea of using nuclear to fight climate change, just off the pie graph, is, as you can see, it's not really the issue.
Well, they always like to compare nuclear to coal, but I think that's intellectually dishonest, because you should be comparing nuclear to renewables.
Mm-hmm.
But even that is presupposes that, I mean, what you like to hear from the industry is that the number of deaths from nuclear will be less than coal and even less than renewables because of the extraction and the metals and maybe the things that go in there. But I mean, you've spoken to Jack Gibbons at the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. Like, what gets lost, and which is what he tries to propose, but what gets lost in this conversation is energy conservation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like, apparently New York State residents use half of the electricity per capita as Ontarians do. So when you're comparing nuclear to other forms like coal, for sure you might get a good image, but the reality is we just need to stop using it when we don't need to be using it.
How much is Trudeau just really a mirage? He's made comments making it sound like he's going to... he made a speech about Indigenous people being potentially the stewards of underdeveloped lands in Canada. Every 5 or 10 years, there's a new push to make it look like Canada cares about Indigenous people.
First of all, the developed lands of Canada are all also stolen land.
Oh, yeah.
So you
right
can't
away.
say that the place we haven't developed yet. Yeah, you can have some sort of like say over that. It's just colonialism,
but even since I was a kid, and well, I know well before that. But every 5 or 10 years, a new minister takes over the ministry responsible, and all kinds of promises and platitudes are made. But the reason why I'm bringing this up is I kind of put my foot, I think, in my mouth a few episodes ago. I was talking to David Feldman, and he said Indigenous issues in Canada are underreported, and apparently things are getting worse. And of course, in my ignorance, I was, pretty sure that things weren't getting worse. And the assumption behind that was that, well, things couldn't have gotten worse from the places that it's been with residential schools and every form of colonialism we've inflicted on them.
Well, if you sorry to interrupt,
but I'm so isolated from the issue.
Yeah,
I am.
If you look at the numbers of kids that were taken into residential schools,
yeah.
I think it's possible that the numbers of kids that have been taken away from their family by children's services right now is greater than the amount of kids that was taken into residential schools. So it's just shifted in terms of its optics.
Right.
There is a huge crisis in First Nations teen suicide
right
now in this quote unquote country.
Yeah.
It is a shame. It is ongoing cultural colonial genocide and dispossession, no matter how you dress it.
Are Torontonians particularly sort of numb to this issue?
Well, I think Idle No More did a lot of raising of visibility. People like to think of themselves as supporting those issues by just having a position and not really engaging in those issues. But I mean, engaging in First Nations communities as a white settler is usually going to be very problematic as well. But I mean, you know, when it comes down to it, you know, I know Dr. Jim was talking on the podcast about some of the things that Kristen Skansen said to the CNSC, and it's a huge problem. And is it getting better? I think for the people who don't have fresh drinking water, for the people whose lands are being destroyed and taken away, for the people who are dealing with generation and generation after trauma and teen suicide, it's not.
I think we all thought Trudeau was going to appeal to the issues of young people, which traditionally have been, you know, environment and issues like native self-government. And yet, at the same time, as you pointed out, they're having their fundraisers. But isn't he defending one of these pipelines, Trudeau?
Yeah, he's defending Kinder Morgan, I believe.
Yeah.
You know, he says he's signed on to the UN Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights, but completely ignores it when it comes to pushing through pipelines. I mean, there's Line 9 is running through Toronto as we speak.
Right.
Tar sands pipeline. And that went in. I mean, what the Committee for Future Generations likes to say is that, you know, the industry has never had permission to destroy our land. And if you do find some sort of permission, it's only through bribing the weak links in our governance systems. And that also happens here. So, I mean, Burnaby, BC had put up a big fight against the pipeline, and their mayor got involved. And here in the city of Toronto, they just sort of sent a letter saying we don't approve the pipeline, but they knew that was rhetorical, and they moved on because there was actually large labor movement support for that pipeline. And it seems like all the NGOs sort of moved on, and people have forgotten that pipeline is flowing and it needs to be shut down. And just because they got it flowing doesn't mean that it can be ignored. It has to be shut down. It's at risk of leaking.
There was a strategy for a while of, I think it was Cameco, some of these giant companies to pump money into Indigenous projects and community centers to sort of, again, manufacture consent.
I mean, Cameco sponsors like the hockey team near the local mine and in Port Hope where they do their refining. Right. But it's one of the largest tax dodgers in Canada. Yeah. So if they're dodging taxes, they're polluting the entire world, but they're, you know, giving a few cents back to the community to print their name on hockey jerseys. Well, you know, that's money well spent for those companies.
There was a great article, Briar Patch Magazine, Follow the Yellow Cake Road.
There's a really good book by an academic called Highway of the Atom by Peter Van Wyck. And it's about the Great Bear Lake and the Dene community that first mined uranium with no protection for the Manhattan Project. This
article talked about the University of Saskatchewan, which is in the center of a large amount of our uranium mining, taking all kinds of money from the corporations involved. The grants and funding produces a lot of papers that are supportive of the talking points that the local miners would want to have believed. And so, in a way, there's this weird incestuous relationship between the corporations and the universities.
I wouldn't call it a weird incestuous relationship. Aside for maybe a very brief moment in the 60s where education looks like it could be about freedom and raising awareness and altering consciousness. Universities have traditionally been like conservative reactionary institutions that protect power, and they largely still are today.
The Fraser Institute.
Yeah, exactly.
Is this would be the ultimate example in Canada of an organization that, I mean, almost everything I've ever heard from them has been, bad news for people who care about the environment. So what you called it as a sort of an echo chamber of conservative thinking often. I was surprised to hear that the Chamber of Commerce, I think, came out and was very supportive of the activities going on in Durham region related to nuclear. And the threat of closing plants had a dollar value, a number of jobs that would be lost, and all. And I think the Chamber of Commerce also recently made a statement about any slowdown in oil sand production and its impact on the economy, jobs, and so on. So the Chamber of Commerce now is the bad guy, who isn't representing the public interest. It's obviously representing the corporate interest. How would a politician balance special interests and lobby opinions and the views of sort of that represent the public trust, essentially? In Sean Patrick Stensel's interview, he pointed out something that I was very surprised by, that would be obvious to probably anyone else, but this division of the decision-making when it comes to nuclear between the CNSC and then the province. And it seems the CNSC is sort of the mechanics of things related to radiation. But there's all these other issues, like should we be exporting nuclear and technologies to foreign nations? Is it ethical to bring the stuff in? Is it actually costing us more money than it's presumably making for us? All these other issues, political, geopolitical, moral, economic, that's all the province. But the way it's framed up to the public is that the CNSC is the last word on all things nuclear.
In 2006, the CNSC approved a bulk shipment of tritium to Iran.
There you go.
And tritium, radioactive hydrogen, is a waste byproduct of nuclear reactors, but it's also the detonating component for nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm. Specifically the H-bomb, yeah.
Yeah, proliferation is good business. I mean, the Paul McKay, who you may want to interview as well, wrote Atomic Accomplice, and he basically says that the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty has been the vehicle for nuclear proliferation. So if you look at how Canada loaned or gave the CANDU technology to India, then Pakistan, and they both just renounced their membership in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty before they exploded their test bombs.
Mm-hmm.
Canada has been very responsible for the proliferation of nuclear weapons through nuclear power.
I like to say Ontario, because the fact of the matter would be that 90% of all of that action actually happened in Ontario, and it's actually Ontario's responsibility, fueling an atomic arms race between, just for example, Pakistan and India. And then it's well known that those technologies have been dispersed to Iran and North Korea, possibly from Pakistan. Is that not?
Yeah.
So we play an important role. Yeah.
So the Toronto City Council Board of Health is about to debate a motion to reaffirm the city as a nuclear weapons-free city. And this is largely symbolic, the same way that Toronto calls itself a sanctuary city, to protect people who don't have status, but they don't end up getting protected, or the same way that the city says we're into Vision Zero, no pedestrians will be killed, but they do nothing about the way cars move in the city, and the body count keeps on piling up. And there's also the fact that the uranium plant at Landsdowne and Dupont at 1025 Lansdowne Avenue, nondescript building, has been sold from GE Hitachi, who manufacture nuclear weapons and manufactured the GE Mark I boiling water reactor that melted down in Fukushima, sold to Babcock Wilcox, BWXT, which was the manufacturer of the 3 Mile Island plant, I believe, but they're also a current manufacturer of nuclear weapons in Los Alamos. And they produce in Los Alamos these grapefruit-sized balls of plutonium that are orders of magnitude stronger than the Hiroshima bomb that go into the Trident missiles. And, each one of those Trident missiles on a submarine that carries, several of these Trident missiles can kill tens of millions of people if tens of millions of people are where it lands.
Well, I remember in the early 80s that Canada made a big deal about declaring itself a nuclear-free zone. Meanwhile, we've been exporting, at least in the past, the uranium that was used for most of all the nuclear weapons in the West. At the same time, we were testing the cruise missile over Canadian land. So this idea of denying complicity is I don't know.
Yeah, well, maybe we should actually call Toronto a nuclear weapons friendly city.
Yeah.
Find us on Twitter @ThatArcher, our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Rate the show on iTunes. It changes the way the show is listed.
And, the food grown in Fukushima Prefecture is probably being exported all over the world. I mean, I'm glad I'm a vegan, but, I wouldn't be eating sushi.
Yeah. Well, I got into the rice and the offshore fish and their livestock. It was a big farming area.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of impacts.
I haven't been thinking about Fukushima much, but it is scary. It is scary.
But I was asking about Japan because I am interested in, what do those hearings look like? I am kind of interested in the differences in nuclear liability acts in various countries and who's actually responsible and who. I mean, it's always the taxpayer that ends up footing the bill. But I am interested in the hearings. They changed the name of their regulator, so I was wondering if the style of the public hearings would have changed if, because they talked a big talk about changing the structure of the regulatory structure in Japan, changing it from NISA to the NRA, the Nuclear Regulatory Authority. Because you would think that in the site of a huge accident would be where the most evidence of change would occur, but what we actually saw was the delaying of information to the public, the constantly underreporting the situation there just over and over and over for years. We actually, I think, saw the blueprint for how public relations will be handled in the next nuclear accident.
Yeah. You can always rebrand. You can always just deny the reality of it. If Pickering melts down, I have this sort of really not so good sort of thought about when or if Pickering melts down. It'll be the most I told you so moment for a few dozen people, but for everyone else, including those dozen people, it will just be the worst. The idea that you would put nuclear plants right on Lake Ontario is just talk about,
There's a cynical...
the greatest wealth we have is that water.
Yeah.
It's not the nuclear plant, it's that water, and we could destroy that.
Yeah. And that it was close to a big city, and that over time a big city then sprung up around it. There was no plan in place to deal with that eventuality. Now it really is just surrounded by residential. Yeah, it's silly. There are upcoming meetings, Toronto Health meetings that you will be attending.
Yeah, the Toronto Board of Health debating the nuclear weapons free city.
Right.
I mean, the only reason that I'm doing that is there was a letter from the Committee for Future Generations to the Board of Health and a list of maybe 30 or 40 people from the nuclear industry, from political parties, from responsible authorities saying that they never had permission to take uranium from their territory, and they don't have permission to continue with the nuclear industry, and it must be shut down, and that the Committee for Future Generations holds you responsible for the deaths resulting from the nuclear industry, whether it be for the quote-unquote peaceful or commercial uses of the nuclear industry or the military uses of the industry. And what we did was we printed out these letters on yellow cardstock, and we delivered them to people, and we videotaped them getting these letters, and they treated us like we were toxic, and we were like as if we were giving them like a handful of plutonium. They just wanted nothing to do with it.
So that's cognitive dissonance, is it not?
I don't know if it's cognitive dissonance, but they know that they like their image of being progressive, of being supporting environment and supporting Indigenous rights, but when they're directly named as someone who is a responsible person being held responsible for this ongoing ecocide and genocide, they don't want to hear it. They don't want to receive it. So I want to go there and I want to remind them of that. And it's part of a few things that I want to do in memory of our friend and fierce warrior, Carrie Lester, who just passed away.
You write for Now.
Yeah, I freelance, contribute to Now magazine.
There's a bunch of articles that you've had published. Can you think of some titles people should look for?
Are we facing near-term human extinction? that was one of my latest. Weapons of mass destruction in Toronto's West End.
And that's about the plant.
That's about the plant and the connection with the new owners. Yeah. Also, another thing I didn't mention about that plant is at the hearings we found out that they do export some of their products to the United States, and they do work with depleted uranium. So there's no real way of verifying that they're not connected to that they're connected to the military use of uranium, but you have to just dispense with the idea that there was ever a separation or ever any possible way to actually distinguish the use of military and commercial.
Let's generate some
nuclear
questions from your point. So,
yeah.
They make the pellets, but they're put into the zirconium cladding at another facility, which brings up a whole point right there. But so you're suggesting they could export some of these pellets. First question would be as well, what, they have CANDU reactors in the United States, which is obviously not. So, but maybe they're making fuel rods for smaller reactors, or what's this? Is there any suggestion as to why they would buy unenriched? Pellets?
we had a list of about 50 questions for the proponent, which was GE, and the CNSC when they came to Toronto for like a hearing we had surrounding the plant, and we never got answers.
Mm-hmm. And maybe they could say, "Oh, it's proprietary information," or
yeah.
But if it's secret, then it kind of sort of says that's obviously something connected with munitions or weapons. Why would they want
for sure.
uranium pellets? But, would you do you entertain going to these hearings, the Deep Geological Repository issue, the Pickering extension hearings, the Darlington refurbishment hearings? Do you because there's different ways, as I tried to point out before. There's the provincial side of it and the federal side of it. So the federal side would be the CNSC federal hearings, but then there is this other side, the provincial side, and maybe municipal health side. Do you tend to stay in one corner?
I want to. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Chalk
Not
River
sure.
hearings. Did you catch any of the
Yeah.
Chalk River hearings? I mean,
Well,
the stuff that's revealed during these hearings is just incredible. And there's no other source of information really on this. We don't see newspapers printing stories about it. We don't, other than people like yourself publishing articles now and then. There certainly isn't a correspondent that follows all of these hearings and
No,
summarizes
definitely
the
not.
public input. I mean, just right there's a journalistic subject on its own that we don't see. What is
Yeah.
it with the media?
What is it with the media?
It's fascinating reading, I would think. If they're really there to sell newspapers, this kind of stuff, I mean, maybe it's just me. The science of it, the all the issues related, again, economics, moral, geopolitics, military, economic, health. All of these things are important and interesting. I think people would lap it up if it was available in the newspapers.
I think media is consolidated, but media is media, and it's up to them, and it's up to all of us to get information out there. But you know what? It's you may find it fascinating, but for most people, it's a big downer.
Right.
Yeah, it's a it's a huge downer.
We talked about this before.
Yeah.
When I talked to you before our interview. It's a huge downer. And it is upsetting when you turn off the hockey or the Murder, She Wrote or whatever, and you start reading news that's got a little more truth salted into it. There's a price to pay, and you said that when you handed out those yellow printed cards to people, you could see a visceral reaction on their faces when they're getting the bad news. How much of an issue is that when you're trying to get your message out? This is why I thought when I first was talking about, there's a camaraderie amongst the people who show up at a lot of these meetings and hearings. This is kind of the sugar that makes the medicine go down in a lot of ways, no? The sense of community.
But you also talked about, or maybe you didn't, but activists tend to burn out.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I've experienced this myself. So and mentioned this 1,000 times in the podcast. There's this swing between it's hopeless, you can't fight City Hall, and it's opposite, that with a righteous indignation, you deserve a world that makes sense. And in the mind of an activist, I've often thought that there's a pendulum that swings back between it's hopeless and we're making baby steps. And then, obviously if the pendulum swings too far in one direction, you become discouraged. You feel like your effort is for nothing. And that would be a disabling and down time. And what I found, a lot of activists say, they actually claim to be, optimists. How would you fall into that model?
I know that people can be more powerful than they had ever imagined. And I also know that when people begin to realize that power, if they do that in a way that is not sustainable, is not safe. You can suffer as a result of that. And that's why no one who is in any way connected to power wanted to touch this issue. Most environmental NGOs wish it would go away. So Vandana Shiva, the activist, was on Democracy Now! And she was talking about nuclear power, and she said that nuclear power is centralized energy, and it presupposes a security state. So, it's not paranoia to know what you're going up against.
What are you writing about next, do you think?
Well, I've been filming documentaries lately about trans teen suicide, transgender teenagers who end their lives because of society's transphobia.
Right.
Yeah.
And that it really is. It's the people's reaction that is the most damaging thing. It's how the people, their family, their friends,
and it's often a fear of what other people will think.
Is it getting better? So I'll lay that tough question. Isn't it getting better? As public becomes more aware of it, as it's injected more and more into our pop culture, and the younger people apparently have more positive views on that. Is that a naive perspective?
Well, trans women of color are murdered all the time.
Huh.
They're just expendable in our white supremacist society. In our hetero dominant white supremacist society. So for the people who are murdered and the people who bullying and Christian conversion therapy drives to suicide, it's not.
What did you describe that as? The conversion therapy. This is for rehabilitating people who are having gender identity questions?
Brainwashing, and it's a form of torture where people who are not even trained to be therapists at all are sitting these often kids down in rooms and telling them that they're disappointing their families, they're going against God, they are sinning, they're sick, they need to be healed, and they are kind of bullied into trying to not acknowledge who they really are.
I've heard some discussion of the idea that there's the other side of it. Could people be intervening too soon with hormone treatments? Like I'm talking about, like below 14 and 15. Can you intervene? And are parents getting involved in this gender identity issue too much? And should we just leave it to the kids to sort out as they transition through their maturity?
What a lot of kids need so they don't develop the characteristics of the gender they don't identify with is puberty blockers. And those blockers just buy time for those children to decide. So they don't have to go on hormone treatments one way or the other, but it can buy them time to make their own decision for when they are old enough.
However, if it wasn't for this intervention by all the people around them, they wouldn't need to buy that time with puberty blockers. They'd just be able to sort it out as they mature. Just to be argumentative.
But that's the thing is that if they physically mature into the gender that they are not, then that's not a good scene for them.
Right. It's a complicated issue. But
Yeah,
isn't our culture moving towards higher levels of acceptance of gender identity issues? Like we have these sub movements. Maybe they're just all show, but of reducing and having programs that protect against bullying. We are seeing gender issues being debated in the sort of politically correct. I mean, we're now talking about this more than we would have been in the past.
No, you know what? Like trans people are still have trouble finding jobs.
Yeah.
They still get thrown under the bus by the LGB before the T.
Yeah.
It wasn't until maybe 2014 that the Trans March in Toronto actually got to take Yonge Street. There's still a hugely discriminated against group of people, even if other people are saying that they shouldn't be discriminated against, and that's getting more attention.
Yeah.
Trans people are at the margins of society, especially if they're sex workers, especially if they're trans people of color, if they're trans people without economic means. Largely the argument for gay marriage was a politics of inclusion within the mainstream.
Yeah.
And that benefited the, well-to-do, white folks who want to invest in real estate just like everyone else, as opposed to the people who are on the margins of being and on the intersections of being queer and disabled, queer and HIV, queer person of color, or even queer people without status. There's so many overlapping issues, and what happens with social progress is it tends to be appropriated in a way that it doesn't actually challenge the greater power structures that maintain injustice.
Interesting. Wow. So, how would you describe the issues that capture your attention? They do seem to be focused around justice. So, social justice and maybe environmental justice. So you are an activist in a way. Could you call yourself an activist?
Reluctantly.
Nobody likes the titles.
I guess I'd like to be more of an artist.
Right.
But also the issue of animal liberation is really close to my heart, because I started protesting marine land, where they have an orca that they stole from the waters off of Iceland in 1979, and it's just sort of like she's just listing there in a bowl.
Apparently that guy has all kinds of lands with thousands of deer on it, all for his own enjoyment. And
mass graves of orcas, whales, dolphins, belugas, sea lions, deer, bear.
So there's SeaWorld and there's marine land.
There's no way to back this up with any evidence. The argument for captivity is that people get to see these animals and they'll be inspired to protect them in the wild, but it's just wrong. We need to protect their wild habitat and protect their ability to be in the wild before they're extinct. So the goal of that campaign was to rescue all of the marine animals, all the animals at marine land, and send them to sanctuaries. In the case of the dolphins and the whales, they would be seaside rehabilitation sanctuaries with the hope of one day releasing them back into the wild.
Yeah. It didn't, I think a former employee, of SeaWorld, I think he wrote a book, and I think he's being sued. Maybe it is.
Yeah, Phil Demers is the whistleblower, I guess. Yeah.
And is that SeaWorld in the U.S.?
That's Marine Land.
Marine Land. So it is up here. And there's an ongoing battle between the owner and former employee / whistleblower.
Yeah, these are SLAP suits, strategic lawsuits against public participation.
Huh. And are you writing about that?
I have written about that in the past, but I'm more concerned now with the fact that eating animals is cruel, is torture to the animal. There's no humane way to kill an animal. There is the human health impact of eating animals, and there's the environmental impact of eating animals. And those three are all connected.
And factory farming. And
yeah, but I don't like that term, factory farming, because even if you have like a small mom and pop farm, you're still killing these animals, and a lot of people who are continuing to eat meat just sort of grasp at and reach at things for why they can still continue to eat it. So no matter how you phrase it, like sustainable, hormone-free, free range, there's no like right way to do the wrong thing, with an exception. People like to tokenize Indigenous people in terms of their hunting practices as a way for those people who are bringing that up to continue eating meat. It's okay because Indigenous people do it. And what I'd say to them is there's a growing movement of Indigenous veganism, but it's also none of our business. They have a right to every one of their traditional practices and their traditional territory, and they have a right to govern as they see fit on this territory. So it's a nuance, but a lot of vegans sort of fall into the trap of becoming sort of like white supremacists by protesting Indigenous rights to hunt. And to them, I say that, if an Indigenous person is hunting, you can't tell them not to hunt. And you can't sort of petition for laws to make it illegal. If you want to tell them not to hunt, they're just, if not more valid in telling you to get off of their land. But just because there's that somewhat of a division there, doesn't mean that we should lose focus on the fact that animal agriculture was the sort of tool of colonial dispossession. It was part of the genocide of the people to get them off of their land. It destroyed the forests and all the natural habitats, and it replaced it with livestock. And if you look at the Earth's surface right now, 45% of the Earth's like non-ice covered terrestrial landmass is devoted to animal agriculture. So if we replaced that with, instead of feeding plants to animals and then animals to people, and just fed plants to people, we could theoretically feed the whole world, eradicate hunger, maybe use 2% of the space that we're using now for animal agriculture. And what we could do with that, the rest of that space, is we could actually reforest that space and sequester possibly as much carbon as been released to the atmosphere since the beginning of the industrial age, and do that within the next 20 years, because when a tree and forest is growing, they will sequester about 80% of their lifetime carbon sequestration in the first 20 years of rapid growth.
A carbon sink.
Yeah, there's a group in Toronto connected with the Save movement called Climate Vegan. That's a pretty cool group that's trying to educate vegans on the environmental impacts of animal agriculture, but also educate environmentalists on the environmental impacts of animal agriculture. Safe and Green Energy closed the tritium production facility in Peterborough, Ontario, where the apples near the Peterborough airport were upwards of thousands of becquerels of tritium. It's a carcinogen, a mutagen, a teratogen. It can cross the placental barrier, cause cancer. It's a 12.3-year half-life, but that means to get rid of it from the ecosystem, it would take 123 years. Meanwhile, it bioaccumulates up the food chain, and there's still a tritium processing facility in Pembroke called SRB. And in the case of the Peterborough facility that was shut down by Safe and Green Energy Peterborough, the owner, Bill Lynch, was also the owner of Shield Source in the United States, and that company had recently abandoned the U.S. safety light factory in Bloomsburg, Ohio, right on the Susquehanna River. And EPA has taken it over as an EPA Superfund to cleanup site, which basically means they've pledged $134 million to remediate the site, but they just put up a barricade and nothing is actually happening. And that...
maybe if they wait 120 years, 240 years, the tritium will...
Well, but there it's also strontium, americium, and radium, because it started as a radium dial factory. But that was abandoned, and that's what this industry does. Like, there's also low-income housing development that was built under the Ontario Affordable Homes Lottery in 1973 in Scarborough called McClure Crescent. Basically, that was land that was contaminated by radium that they built homes on and raffled them off for very cheap amounts to people in Scarborough, and it's still contaminated with radium. I mean,
and why? How did the radium come to be there?
The radium came to be there. I'm not so up on the story, but there was a production facility somewhere, and one of the employees or one of the managers of that production facility was taking the rags that they used to wipe up the radium and taking them back to that site on McClure Crescent to get the radium out of them, and was secretly selling them to the Nazis in the 30s or 40s, because the radium was used as imaging for structural integrity of metal in tanks and things like that.
Wow.
So that's still contaminated, that spot, and people don't really know it.
I'm pretty sure I remember when I was a teenager, I think there were some remaining buildings around Jarvis Street that were being torn down, and it showed up in the paper, and they talked about the dial painters. I'm pretty sure it was around Jarvis Street.
Yeah, there was also a radium dial factory on Victoria Street, right at Yonge and Dundas, that was turned into like a language college and finally just demolished a couple of years ago for the building of a condo. And one of the activists who knew about the GE issue said that they basically did it on a weekend, guys in hazmat suits, but dust flying everywhere. So one of the things with the nuclear industry and their decommissioning is that when you decommission, there's not only a toxic legacy that is built up, but in the act of decommissioning, you can have one final great release of all the sort of built up contaminants. And that happened right at Yonge and Dundas, and it was kind of done under the cover of darkness. And for the people who are walking down the street at Yonge and Dundas and potentially inhaling that uranium, that radium.
Well, this is an interesting issue. So, and we see this a lot. So that if there was proper public information, the public would be able to mitigate some of these effects. So there's this, someone's making this choice between the bad public relations created and our ability to mitigate as citizens. Keep Johnny in out of the rain on Tuesday.
Yeah, but that causes more attention, and that's just what they don't want. I mean, they're happier with Johnny getting cancer because it will never be on them.
Wow.
Like, for example, the alpha particles that are coming out of the uranium factory, and the kids walking on the street right next to the building where they're emitting those particles, alpha radiation won't penetrate the skin, but if you have a cut, it'll go in, and if you breathe it in, it'll go in, and once you breathe it in, it can just be lodged in the lung and act like a ember, just scattering your cells. And because it's got such a short sort of like radioactive diffusion, the damage is not if it kills cells, but if it damages cells, and that those cells replicate and then cause a mutation, which could be a cancer.
This brings us back to this. One of the public relations things they've done, well, one of them is that in different jurisdictions they have different units of measurement of radiation. But the biggest thing they do is to confuse and conflate the difference between, quote, radiation, unquote, and particles, which you ingest and have direct tissue contact. So they keep talking about it in terms of, flying from here to Vancouver or bananas or...
Yeah. Like GE had a chart that they gave out saying radiation in our daily life, and the amount that was you were dosed from GE was just minuscule compared to flying to Vancouver. But they're measuring that in gamma radiation.
Yeah.
Gamma radiation being a long form radiation. The real danger from that plant is the alpha particles.
It's the particles of uranium, the particles of plutonium, of radium, and tritium.
And tritium, yeah, which is a beta emitter.
So people, we keep hearing about tritium, and we have this abundance of tritium because CANDU nuclear reactors make 100 times the tritium as their American counterparts. So this is why we're always awash in tritium. And this is why we have such high standards for our tolerance of tritium.
Yeah, 7,000 becquerels per liter is the current standard. In 2009, the Ontario Liberal government set up the Ontario Drinking Water Advisory Council, and that council made a recommendation of lowering the allowable limit of tritium in drinking water to 20 becquerels per liter, which would be more in line with other jurisdictions over the world, but they haven't acted on that because they need to keep the standard up at 7,000 so that no matter what they release, they can say we're below the standard, and there isn't any, doesn't give activists any leverage to, in that regard to take on this toxic poison that's in our water. That's in our water and in our bodies. I mean, like when you drink a glass of water in Toronto, you're drinking tritium. It's tritium punch. When you take a shower and you breathe in the steam, you're breathing in tritium. It's disgusting.
You mentioned that they're taking samples often of the air from the smokestack at that uranium pellet plant. Why?
Yeah, they do their own monitoring, though.
Right, but theoretically, I should, on my cell phone, be able to see right now. I mean, I'm paying for those measurements one way or another.
No, they're just compiled quarterly or by the end of the year. And I mean, at the time, they said they were verified by independent third parties. And we asked, well, who are the independent third parties? And they said, we can't say that. That's proprietary information.
Right. Well, I always found it interesting that the Ministry of Natural Resources houses the CNSC. And essentially, the Ministry of Natural Resources, I can go there. I'm pretty sure it's the same ministry. I can see real-time live seismic data from various seismological installations. Same ministry hosts the Environment Canada website. I can get real-time live radar, see where all the clouds are. But why can't I also get a map of Canada and see these measurements, which are being taken daily, but as you say, are only released quarterly, and they're totaled, so we don't actually see spikes. We can't mitigate our exposure because of the secretive approach they have. I just find it's all the same ministry that houses the CNSC that I get my real-time live seismological data, but I can't see the radiation data that I'm paying them to collect.
So here's what they believe, and this is from Commissioner Velshi of the CNSC, who said this at the meeting. She suggested that the health impacts resulting from the psychological fear and stress that are irrational about the possibility of radiation being bad for you is worse than the exposure to the actual radiation.
Well, let me suggest to you that the stress caused by not having access to that data overwhelms all of the inputs.
Yeah.
Who's to say?
Yeah.
It sounds like there's going to be some turnover in that board at the CNSC. There's some people leaving
Yeah.
and new people. But they'll just be handpicked from the nuclear industry as usual. And
Yeah, I
we're
mean,
not gonna-
the latest technocrat that was the president was Michael Binder, and he was terrible. I mean, he's just a terrible guy. And I think most of the people in the CSC even knew that. He was just a bureaucrat administrator brought in to just move things along.
So how optimistic are you about millennials, the
How
people that we're
optimistic?
transferring the power to? Is there something that makes them more or less likely to get involved in community issues?
I don't know. I can't speak to that, but what I can speak to is the alarming lack of millennials in the anti-nuclear movement,
Okay.
which is a challenge to millennials and a challenge to the current stewards of that movement to pass along that information. But I mean, you have to ask yourself, why didn't Dakota Access Pipeline type of standoff and protest didn't happen in the Toronto area when Enbridge was digging and refitting their pipes?
Yeah.
I mean, driving to Dakota would be, hours and hours and hours, but there were some Enbridge integrity dig sites that were happening, within close, within like a 4-minute walk from a subway station.
Okay.
And where was Toronto for that? So as much as people want to say, like, I support the Dakota Access Pipeline struggle, everyone completely had their head in the sand for the fact that there's a tar sands pipeline, equivalent tar sands pipeline, but older one, a 40-year-old pipeline running through the north end of Toronto.
Okay, we're about to. They've already voted in their cartoon character, and we're about to have Doug Ford. We're obviously not taking voting seriously. Is a consequence of our frivolous society, our Western decadence, that we just don't care anymore about things that are supposed to matter. I mean, that's really cynical, but we keep voting for and doing things that aren't in our best interest and turning our eyes away from things that don't make us feel good. Are we no longer qualified to participate in a democracy?
No, I don't agree with the whole premise. I'm sorry. Like, I don't even really believe in voting. And I don't believe in the reverence that people give to, like, electoral democratic processes. Like, I believe in direct democracy, but I think that
well, how can you have a democracy with two parties or two parties that vote in blocks? So there's some flaws. I get it.
Well, the thing is with Indigenous governance, they have systems of governance and the Great Law and things that were already in place before we colonized. So when you vote, you actually sort of like reaffirm your belief and your participation in the project known as Canada. But furthermore, in terms of Doug Ford, I think that Doug Ford is a populist, and all the power to him in the respect that he is speaking to people who feel like they are not being heard, and his message about sort of tackling elites reverberates. And all I can say about that is, sure, he would be disastrous, but it's just sort of a kind of quality of disaster that would be different from the sort of the austerity budgets planned by the NDP and what the Liberals are doing. Meanwhile, what's really lacking is any appeal to empowering people who are low income and impoverished and making things better from them from any one of your choices. So until something can come around which really not only gives people the vernacular of empowering them, but truly empowers them, we will get the government that we deserve, whether that be Ford or Wynne.
Interesting. So I'm just interested in the connections between Trump and Doug Ford and this idea of populism spreading north. or somebody had suggested it was invented here, exported south, and came back. And it seems to be all over the world. I just wonder if there's something that's changed in our culture that makes us more susceptible to it now than at other times, because we haven't invented disenfranchising the poor recently.
No, but we're not susceptible to it. We're ready for it, and I think that what we need is some left-wing populism. Like we need someone to emerge to.
I think some people were hoping Trudeau would have been that, and yet he's for the pipelines and doing the same thing we've always done to Indigenous people, which is just, apple pie in the sky rhetoric and no action.
I think that people who are activists on the front lines never had any illusions about what Trudeau was about. I mean, like the exporting of weapons to Saudi Arabia, and then which are used to sort of like do some of the most terrible crimes against people, like that continues. So he's kind of Harper, but with a different exterior.
Minus the sweater and better hair. In Ontario, there is no hope of any meaningful change in terms of our nuclear policy because the three main parties are all equally pro-nuclear.
Yeah, that's good to point out. And the NDP is so because of the labor movement's support for nuclear, and that just goes to show you where the labor movement is right now. What we need from the labor movement is things like general strikes, but they seem to believe that because they're sort of bound by when their contracts expire and when they're legally allowed to strike, that they only have to strike within those certain parameters. But what they need to do is they need to have a general strike, and they need to leverage their collective bargaining power to protect the seniority, the income, and the jobs of everyone who's currently employed in a dirty and unhealthy industry, and demand transitions to progressive markets and green energy and things that don't harm the earth. And those transitions have to be made in a way that grandfathers the current workers and doesn't use that opportunity as a way to get rid of those who have benefits and seniority in favor of replacing them with low-waged workers. But what you see in like the auto unions, for example, is in the tiers of different union locals, you'll have the old-timers throwing the new employees under the bus. And the labor movement is it's pretty corrupt, actually. That's why you get a lot of people, for example, like the Ford Nation people, being very anti-union, because sometimes unions can just look like a different sort of management. What we need from unions is actually to harness their greatest strength, which is collective bargaining and striking, even if they're not legally allowed to strike at any particular time. I mean, the power of workers when they come together, like legitimately, I don't think that can be defeated. It just has to happen. And so these workers need to stand up for their fellow workers. Like there's a man named Dan Rutka who lives in Port Hope who was working a Zircotech, the sister plant to the GE plant, uranium processing, and he got doused as a practical joke by some employees with enriched uranium powder. He's had a double lung transplant. His sinuses have been replaced with titanium plates, and he just won't die. He's a fighter. We think of all these industries polluting people and they die. But sometimes they don't die, but they live, and they live through the worst suffering and health challenges. And he's been completely abandoned by his union.
I often wonder about where are the unions at these nuclear plants. They should be out every time there's a little incident. We should be hearing from the union how their workers were threatened or new standards have to be deployed. And we never hear the bad news about nuclear, not even from the unions who are supposed to be looking after the workers. I think recently a bunch of workers were sent home at one of the projects at Darlington for not following safety procedures, and there's a bunch of questions about are these properly trained workers? Do they even speak the language well? They're just grabbing anyone. And there's the union should be right on top of all this, training.
But those are not unionized workers.
Exactly.
Those are the contract workers.
Yeah.
And the union should strike so they can avoid the fact that there are non-unionized workers working in the same environment.
Exactly.
But I think that honestly they don't mind that because some of the migrant labor they use in these places are the ones who are in the most toxic roles.
Right. We saw the same thing in Japan after Fukushima. They would farm out very desperate workers and go to very poor areas and recruit people, underpay them, and have them do the dirty work. How do people follow you, read your stuff, find you on YouTube, watch your documentaries? How do we...
My YouTube channel, which I don't really update that much, has a lot of nuclear videos. Maybe you'll post some on your podcast.
Absolutely.
Description, the greatest hits, and they can see them there. Yeah. Otherwise, I don't really do social media that much.
That's antisocial.
It might be, but.
That was Zach Ruiter, writer, interviewer, and activist. Check out the show notes for links to some of his work. tmi.twxnet.com. We reached Zach by phone from his home in Toronto.
Find us on Twitter @thatarcher. Send us an email, archer@twxnet.com. For guest links and contact info, visit our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Find us on Android and Apple Podcast apps. Subscribe and rate the show on iTunes.
This has been TMI.